dignitaries on the dais, and friends. For the Department of Civics and Politics, and also for our Institute on International Relations in the University of Mumbai, this is a major event when we are having students not only from our own departments but also from various affiliated colleges in this particular program related to the G20. And I'm very happy, sir, to welcome you all. Welcome Ambassador Sujan Chanoy, our friend Professor Harsh Pant, and all other colleagues in the university. This is the first of its kind event in the university during India's G20 presidency, but this is not going to be the last one. And we have spoken informally to our friends in the ORF and also friends in the entire G20 activities that we would like to work together with the ORF and the G20 groups and also with various affiliated colleges in this particular year, and also to take this conversation further after all these activities are over. Now, most of the times, activities related to whether it is G20 or whether it is other Indo-Pacific forums or other forums, many times the discussions are security concerned, internal security concerned, or international relations concerned. As I spoke to Ambassador Chenoy and Professor Pant, we would like to take this particular conversation in a much more deeper and substantive manner, and also talk about in a comparative manner on urbanization, also talk about governance, identity, and other issues. And probably more intellectual work would happen in different parts of the country. I think one more event is happening in Symbiosis. So from a state public university, you are going to a private university, and you will be able to see the difference not only in the nature of discussion and deliberation but also in the nature of stakeholders. Our students, our faculty come from they are a different breed, and you will find that faculty from private universities are a different breed. We are in a position to compete. We are in a situation to have dialogue and negotiate with people. I'm very happy in this auditorium to welcome you all, and I hope that the address by Professor Chinoy and the presence and discussion by Professor Pant is going to help us all in having some serious deliberation, followed by the discussion on the book by Ashish Sandurkar, which we are going to have post lunch. Our students have, I think, two students from Professor Bala Bhosle's Institute and Bhushan's Institute are going to make a presentation. And sir, I assure you that at this time, in this particular case, we have not come out with our full quantitative and intellectual strength, but I assure you that as our partnership goes further, we will have more deeper and substantive engagement. Thanks and welcome you all again. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Pawar. I now invite Professor Harsh Pant, Vice President, Studies and Foreign Policy, Observer Research Foundation, and Co-Chair, Task Force 7, Think 20, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. And Ambassador Chinoy, Professor Pawar, and members of ORF, students and faculty members of Mumbai University. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be able to have a conversation on India, G20, global order, multilateralism, and in particular to welcome Ambassador Chinoy to Mumbai University and Mumbai as part of this outreach that we are trying to do to have stakeholders like students in particular getting involved with this process of India's G20 presidency. So it's wonderful to see so many of you here. And I'm sure the star power of Ambassador Chinoy is the reason you are here. So I will not be taking a lot of time, but I think it is important to contextualize the discussion today on towards reform multilateralism, because that has been one of the most important tracks that we are following as part of the G20 initiative, T20 as part of T20, and to have students think about what not simply about G20 but what it represents and why we are talking about G20 in the way we are, why India's presidency of G20 has excited not only people in India, but also a lot of the countries abroad when they are looking at India and looking at India's leadership in the context of G20 through a different lens. What does it mean for India? What does it mean for us as ordinary Indians? What does it mean for you as students? And I think what does it mean for thinking about the state of the world today? And that is, I think, some of the issues that we wanted today to reflect upon, and to have Ambassador Chinoy come and talk to you directly, given that he is leading this T20 initiative. He's the chair, and also one of the leading thinkers, of course, on foreign policy, strategic policy issues. Now, I don't think he needs any introduction. But he's the Director General at the moment, serving as the DG of Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, which is India's foremost defense think tank and strategic policy think tank. Of course, he has had a long-standing distinguished career as one of India's foremost diplomats, serving as the ambassador to Japan and an ambassador to Mexico, amongst others. But in the last few years, since he has been leading IDSA, he has also been one of the foremost public intellectuals talking about foreign policy, strategic policy, defense policy, issues concerning the way we think of national security and foreign policy, and how do we conceptualize and operationalize it on the ground. So it's wonderful to be able to have him here and to have a direct conversation with you. So we look forward to that. Before that, just very briefly commenting on some of the conceptual issues that we are trying to understand. I think it goes without saying that the world order is changing rapidly. I mean, you must be feeling it every day simply by reading newspapers or watching news. And that world orders, this is once in a lifetime thing that is happening. The inflection points are everywhere. Power is shifting. In which direction, perhaps we don't know, but some shifts are happening. And as a result, institutional infirmities, institutional weaknesses are very, very clear. Some of the things that we were talking about before COVID struck us, I think, have been accelerated. So this idea that global institutions are not working today is widely taken for granted. And we saw that very, very visibly. It affected all of us when the WTO, when the World Health Organization, WHO, did not work during the initial phase of COVID-19. And I think that is something that is a reminder in terms of how multilateralism, its effectiveness or lack of it affects us in our day-to-day lives. So as we look around the world today, as we look at the Ukraine crisis on the one hand, aggression by China on the other, as we look at America's inward orientation, as we look as Europe's coming to terms with its own defense and security issues, as we look at the churn in the Indo-Pacific, all of these issues are in some way intertwined by the inability of global institutions, global institutional frameworks, and their inability to come to terms with these challenges. And so how do we think about this? How do we think about multilateralism is a big issue. And therefore, one of the key tracks of G20 is how do we conceptualize and reconceptualize the emergence of a new global multilateral order. And that is something that I think India's presidency of G20 exemplifies. That a lot of focus today is on the G20 because it is a platform that seemingly is able to bring stakeholders together that are otherwise not on speaking terms. So you have Russia sitting there, China sitting there, West sitting there, and India and emerging powers sitting with some of the established powers, trying to sort out a global governance agenda. And that's the most important challenge that we face. How do you have a global governance agenda where all the stakeholders are invested in? So can we think of multilateralism in a context in which the post-1945 institutional framework can be replaced by a more effective framework? And across the board, the challenges, whether WHO, WTO, UN Security Council, they're bound. And so how do we think about this as students of international politics, as many of you are, as practitioners of Indian diplomacy, like Ambassador Chinoy, and as thinkers and as those who are interested, as students or as observers of international relations? I think all of those questions are intertwined by that, and India and Indians cannot really take their eye off the ball. For a very long time, one could have said, well, we are on the margins. Our ability to dictate what happens at the global stage is relatively limited. We can't say that about India today. So therefore, it is very important that youth is involved, that students who are beginning their journey as observers and thinkers of international politics and in Indian foreign policy, they are involved, and this is a small effort in that direction. And this year, which is going to be the year of the India's presidency of the G20, is perhaps an important year to therefore cogitate, to think, to meditate on how we move forward from there. With those words, let me give the floor back to the MC and also then to Ambassador Chinoy, who will have much more substantive things to say on this. And I look forward to a wonderful interaction with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Pant. May I now invite Ambassador Sujan Chenoy, Chair, Core Group T20 India 2023, and Director General, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, to deliver his lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Deepak Pawar, Professor B.V. Bhonsle, Professor Harsh Pant, for those very kind and generous words. Mr. Jaibal Naduvat, who heads the ORF team. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you very much for inviting me today to Mumbai. I'm very pleased to be here today and to have a chance to stand before you as not only the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses, but also in my capacity as the Think 20 Chair for India during its G20 presidency. A moment ago, Professor Pant, in his generosity, informed you that I would deliver the star performance. Well, I'm full of trepidation at that introduction that you're given, because I'm neither famous nor notorious, and you have to be one of the two to be called a star these days. And I was found taking a picture of you all while sitting there, and I must candidly admit that that's for my brag book, though I don't have much of a Twitter following, but that does not stop me from putting out news on a daily basis. And I must do this because this is a very important event. I have come here as part of a much broader vision that we have at the level of the Prime Minister of India. There is this vision of bringing the entire country together, to bring all institutions, all think tanks, all universities around the country together to think deeply about the issues that affect us all today. And we are at a stage when the external world and our domestic policies are united more than ever before. And therefore, it's vital that I stand before you, the youth of India, the future of India, to share some thoughts on reformed multilateralism and the possibilities of transforming these institutions and frameworks that we have lived with since the end of the Second World War. But before I do that, let me simply put it into context, taking a lead from Professor Harsh Pant. He has very kindly given you the context, the broad global picture, the landscape, as we might call it. The fact is that this whole issue of multilateralism has acquired greater salience today because of a number of factors. And among them, for instance, are that for the first time in history since 1945, we have seen that India has become one of the world's most dynamic economies. We have put that colonial past behind us, we have put our Fabian socialism behind us, and we have become the fifth largest economy in the world today, the most resilient of the economies in the post-pandemic phase. So it's a point of inflection, a point of opportunity for the country that didn't exist in the past. The second point that strikes me today is fundamentally the parallel rise of two of the world's most populous nations, China and India. The story between the 70s and up to the beginning of this century was about the phenomenal rise of China, the fact that China had brought 800 million people out of poverty, its infrastructure, connectivity, its emergence as the manufacturing hub for the world. But that story is no longer limited to China. We are today witnessing the fundamental rise of two of the world's largest nations, most populous nations, and two of Asia's largest countries, India and China, together. But the problem here is that there are also differences in this rise. There is India rising as a democracy. It's got, the sort of backing of a large number of the liberal democratic, countries around the world, the nations. And so we represent a particular strand of development, a particular strand of governance, a particular strand of socio-economic progress. On the other hand, China represents another extreme. It represents what some might call an illiberal authoritarian method. The third point that strikes me today is that there is deepening great power, major power contestation along a number of axes, as I might call them. And I have, for sake of brevity, summarized them into 6 factors. I refer to them as the 6 T's that drive the discourse today. The first is trade, which is a fundamental factor in the process of globalization, but has increasingly come under duress and stress in recent years. There is a move towards protectionism, towards regionalism, towards export controls, towards tariff and non-tariff barriers, phytosanitary barriers. And so therefore, one of the fundamentals of the process of globalization is actually under challenge. Though I would also venture to state that it is virtually impossible today to cap trade. It is much easier to weaponize technology. It is much easier to weaponize investment, but less so in the case of trade. And which is why we see that despite the greatest of challenges between the United States and China, or for that matter between China and India, we have seen huge spikes in the trade volumes. For example, between India and China, the bilateral trade figure for 2022 has touched an astounding 135 billion US dollars. And that's up from the figure that we had for the previous year, which was $117.5 billion. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this is the first T, which is under challenge. But technology, as I mentioned, is also under challenge because it's being increasingly weaponized in the process of globalization. The third T is that of territory. There are innumerable disputes, historical differences that abound in our part of the world particularly, but Europe is also not inured to this, as we have seen in the unfolding war in Ukraine. And so territory and territorial differences are also becoming a major factor in the process of globalization. The fourth T is that of terrorism, which also affects the entire world today. The export of terrorism, state-funded terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, individual radicalization of the self. This is a malaise that is to be seen around the world. And it has a huge impact on the way in which societies can remain stable. And without stability, there is no way that a society can make socio-economic progress in particular. The fifth is that of tenets, because there are alternative narratives today competing one with the other. Socio-economic models of development, models for political expression, models of governance, these are vastly different. And we have seen, for instance, in recent years, this narrative spill out into the open. There was always a war between these narratives in the past as well. We have seen, the United States, for instance, affected by the Red Scare in the period of McCarthyism in the 1940s and 50s. We have seen how CENTO and CIETO and all these great, anti-communist groupings were also formed. But the narrative today is out in the open much more because of, relatively speaking, the success that China has also achieved with regard to its economic development. So it's been able to challenge the old notion that the Soviets could develop their technologies in outer space and atomic energy, but they were not really in the game as far as economic development was concerned. They were not really a country with deep pockets, even when they were at the height of their power. So therefore, the narrative is out in the open today, the liberal versus illiberal, the authoritarian versus the democratic, and which has delivered better. And the last one is the T of trust, for there is a great lack of it. There has always been a lack of trust in international relations, no one's a permanent friend or a permanent enemy. There's only permanent interests as far as countries are concerned. But today it is apparent that trust is at an all-time low. Now the framework that we are looking at, the one that affects us all, for we are not living in an ivory tower. India as a nation must exist in a constellation of nations, and that constellation of nations that we exist in, that system that we have, is the one that was created at the end of the Second World War. In 1945, when the world came to grips with the devastation of the second of the two great wars in quick succession, millions of people had been killed, and that came atop the utter failure of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, which tried to create a stable structure for peace and security. And it had failed to accommodate the exceptional interests of the great powers themselves. And so therefore it was the United States of America that did not really support the League of Nations, and that it was a Germany and Japan that found themselves unable to exist within the framework, within the restrictive space that the League of Nations was trying to create. We saw the militarization subsequently of Germany and Japan. And all those great powers that had actually been part of the League of Nations began to leave the League of Nations in the 1930s. Japan left after the invasion of Manchuria and the Mukden incident, for instance. But we also saw Germany depart, we saw Italy depart, we saw Spain depart from the League of Nations. And therefore, at the end of the Second World War, really it was a structure that was being attempted for the second time. And this time it was driven by a power that had emerged onto the scene during the war years, and that was the United States of America. The US was not a particularly big military power, nor one that was interested in proselytization around the world, except in the Woodrow Wilson years around the 1920s. But yet it was a power that had been thrust frontally into the Great War. It became a great manufacturing hub for France and for Britain to carry out the war effort against Germany and Italy and the Axis powers. And at the end of 1945, the world saw for the first time in history a peaceful transition from a leading hegemon to a rising hegemon. Never before have we seen this peaceful transition, but the baton was given seamlessly by the United States, by Great Britain to the United States of America. That is the only example. It is unlikely to be repeated in this century. A number of structures also came up around that time. The United Nations itself was set up in the hope that peace and stability would prevail, in the hope that we, the people, as the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations states, we, the people, would do 1, 2, 3, 4 for the people of the world. And it also saw the emergence of a very large number of institutions around the United Nations, whether it was the World Health Organization or UNESCO, UNICEF, the Bretton Woods institutions, the financial institutions, but they were all creatures of the great powers. They were creatures of the power configuration that had emerged at the end of that Second World War. And therefore, this great institution called the United Nations was established in 1945 with just 51 members. India was a founding member then as well. The 5 permanent veto-wielding members represented the victors. And you might ask quite logically, why was the Republic of China included at that point of time? It was not a victor, so to speak. It was a victim of that war. Some of its geography had been ground for the Second World War, especially in regard to Japan. But the Republic of China was invited as a poor, large, populous, agrarian country without nuclear weapons, without being the powers that France, Germany, UK, and the United States were, or for that matter, even the Soviet Union. It was taken to be a great power. And I think for this, we must look at the policies of Franklin Roosevelt, because by the late 1930s, he was actually toying with the ideas of spheres of influence. And he had already spoken about the 4 global policemen. This is, of course, a world apart from what we are looking at today. This is not an era also of spheres of influence, as Lloyd Austin, the Secretary for Defense, said at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore last year, when he heard General Wei Fenghe of China speak. And he said, this is not an era of spheres of influence. But when you hearken back to the past, you see that it was the United States of America that spoke of spheres of influence, and one of the reasons why the Republic of China was able to come in. Of course, the membership of the Republic of China ended abruptly in 1971 when it was replaced by the People's Republic of China as a result of this great game that was being played, a resetting of relations between the United States and the People's Republic, a kind of creation of a new strategic partnership in order to enable the both of them to better deal with a rising Soviet Union that was marching ahead in terms of its space and other nuclear weapons and other technologies. So we have to keep this in mind. And during the Cold War, one can say that this imperfect structure, a structure in which exceptionalism was embedded right from the start, from the time that the UN Security Council was created, there were 5 permanent members with veto power. An organization that has never lent itself to any kind of reform, except once in 1961, when the UN Security Council agreed to extend and expand the non-permanent category from 6 to 10. Something that was implemented only in 1965, which is why you have 15 members now. But it has never been reformed since then, after 1965. And during the Cold War, there was a broad understanding between the two blocs that they would be able to use veto power against each other, but they'd also carved out spaces for themselves around the world. They engaged in proxy wars against each other from Vietnam to Angola to Afghanistan. And it was a system that seemed to work as well during the Cold War. I'm not suggesting that it was an ideal system, but it was a system that apparently worked. Neither of these two blocs had any great economic interdependence between them. And therefore, most decisions with regard to trade or technology were clean cut, not like today's world in which there is so much interdependence between the United States and, for instance, China, and the rest of us have relations with the both of them. It makes for a very complex situation. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it was preceded by the fall of the Berlin Wall. And thereafter, we have seen this kind of interdependence grow, which didn't exist earlier. And I think that in recent years, the global situation has become even more complex. One of the fundamental reasons is the fact of rising tensions between the United States and China, which have only been, accelerated by the politics of the pandemic and more fundamentally the entire sort of competition and rivalry for the future of the Indo-Pacific. To add to this turmoil, we have seen, quite apart from the tensions between the United States and China over trade, territory, technology, and all those 60s that I mentioned, there is also the war in Ukraine, which has created a new situation in terms of shortages of food, fuel, fertilizers, but also fundamentally challenging the notion that security in Europe was a settled matter. So for the first time since 1945, we are seeing a fundamental questioning also of that security. People had been deemed to be sleeping at the wheel there because of the creation first of the EEC, later the EU, and the kind of integration that took place at the political and economic and social level, one could not have imagined that in the heartland of Europe, there would be this great fundamental question about the future of international peace and security. Meanwhile, we have seen how the other UN structures like the WTO and other frameworks like the WHO, which were managing the fallout of international relations, have also systematically seen erosion of their influence. The WTO, for instance, has been weakened greatly as a result of the absence of a fully functional dispute settlement mechanism or the related appellate body, for instance, in the WTO. These are not working. China, despite having entered the WTO in 2001 and benefited from it, has not been recognized as a market economy at the end of 15 years for reasons that are obvious, for it is not a market economy. And we have seen how the WHO was also racked by the politics of the pandemic. And so today, when we look at that structure which has been bequeathed to us since 1945, it's amazing to see that there are spent powers sitting there. The United Kingdom is clearly a spent power. And there would be, by today's yardsticks, no fundamental reason why the UK should be in the UN Security Council, but it is there as a legacy. For you cannot alter that structure without the fullest cooperation and approval of all 5 permanent members. And so there are vested interests that prevent any kind of change. And it is not to argue for anyone that it is nuclear weapons that helps you be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That's wrong, because in 1945, only one of the 5 permanent members had a demonstrated capacity for nuclear weapons. And China acquired its nuclear weapons in 1964 and became a member only in 1971. And so therefore, if we were to look at in a dispassionate manner about India's credentials today, it has credentials that are far superior to what, for instance, the Republic of China had when it was offered a seat in the UN Security Council in 1945, or for that matter, excuse me, the People's Republic of China when it was brought in 1971. We have the 5th largest economy in the world. We have a demographic dividend today. We are up there in the ranking nations with demonstrated ability in space, in regard to atomic energy. We are also a nuclear weapon state, and yet India has not been able to secure for itself a seat at the permanent membership of the Security Council. And so therefore, I want to come to a broad supposition here that global orders cannot be tinkered with lightly. They cannot be dismantled easily. Usually a change comes about in global orders as a result of tumultuous changes, cataclysmic changes, catastrophes, wars, or complete erosion of economic power. And we have not quite seen that happen yet. And so it does not come about as a result of change of heart. And so no amount of pleading for reforms is likely to bring about that change. It will bring about a fundamental change when the balance of power shifts in favor of India. And currently the trends suggest that India is definitely on a trajectory that takes it to the middle of this century. We have, as you know, entered the Amrit Kal period. The next 25 years are crucial, and we are confident that India will end the 25-year period by the time we celebrate the centenary of our independence. We will be one of the top 2 or 3 economies in the world, and we will have shifted the balance of power in our favor. And we can also see that the Western countries, the liberal, open democracies, the world at large, including the great entrepreneurs and multinational companies, are taking a long-term bet on the future of India, as you've all seen. I do believe that this uncertainty today is best described as one in which power is fractured. There is no country today in the world that is in a position to call shots on all issues at all times. And in this, we have seen a great leveling of the ability to bridge absolute gaps and asymmetries in power. This kind of ability today is in the hands of states and non-state actors. And this ability is demonstrated by possession of certain technologies, disruptive technologies, the use of, for instance, the cyberspace, the possession of nuclear weapons, which is the kind of ability demonstrated, for instance, by a state like North Korea, which has, through its 6 nuclear tests and umpteen missile tests, demonstrated the ability to get President Trump to sit across the table with Kim Jong-un a few times. So I'm talking about the ability today on the part of states and non-state actors to bridge absolute gaps that might exist, asymmetries in comprehensive national power. That doesn't matter anymore. For you can use missiles that cost less than $1 million today to threaten an anti-aircraft carrier, an aircraft carrier worth $7 to $8 billion, which is how the Dongfeng 21 missile that the Chinese have developed can threaten, the big aircraft carriers of the US task forces. So it's a very different world today. And we have seen that there is increasing competition today virtually in every field. There is military and economic competition. There is competition even in regard to the responsibility for climate change, accountability, and the specter of terrorism, cross-border terrorism continues to haunt us. I must also add here that not every country has benefited fully from this rapid integration of the global economy that we saw, particularly after the end of the Cold War, and particularly after the reset in relations between the United States and China in the early 70s, and after China began to open up its economy in the late 70s. And that led to what one might call 50 years, half century of a strategic partnership between the United States and China, something that has ended quite abruptly and is unlikely to be revived in the future. And so we have to look at the fact that one of the great disruptions in this global order today is the rise of China, its militarization, its unilateralism, its desire to work both within the system and to also create new systems and frameworks that are more in the likeness of the People's Republic of China. So China, a fundamental beneficiary of the UN system, a beneficiary of the exceptionalism in the UN Security Council as a permanent member, a beneficiary as a member of the WTO, a country to whom the United States in the year 2000 gave an unmitigated permanent trading status, that this China would obviously not want to cut the very limb on which it is sitting. For this is the global order post-1945 that has given rise to the People's Republic of China and given it all these opportunities to transform itself. But within that system, it is also coming close to challenging the global order, for it believes that its moment has arrived and that the United States is on decline. I think that's a fundamentally erroneous assessment that the PRC is making, but it has not stopped it from creating parallel structures like the BRICS New Development Bank, or for that matter, the AIIB, Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And mind you that there are some structures which it has created as parallel structures to the Bretton Woods structures, which in fact have been supported by India. But this is not to say that India supports the unilateral, financing that is given to the Belt and Road projects by Chinese banks. These are two very different and completely separate tracks. So where you find that India has been able to work together with China, it's on the tracks where the broad representation is that of the interests of the global South, but not with regard to the debt trap diplomacy or the kind of state capitalism, the kind of financing that its own banks, national banks, have extended to Belt and Road projects. Now, Asia's geography, I might say a few words here, is also changing rapidly. It's being redefined by the vision of the Indo-Pacific, and there is a fair bit of dissent on the idea of the Indo-Pacific coming from the Chinese, the Russians. There is a great deal of questioning as to why do you need this whole notion of the Indo-Pacific when we have the idea of the Asia-Pacific and it works just as well. And when one must differ here and set the broad context for this, because the Asia-Pacific represents a particular concept that came about after the end of the Second World War, when the greatly diminished powers of Asia, particularly Japan and others, were revived as a result of active equivalents of the Marshall Plan. And then as rising economies had access to that one great market in the world that is across the Pacific, the United States of America. So Japan grew under that model. The other Asian tigers like the Republic of Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, all these grew in the second stage. And in the third stage of that great concept of the Asia-Pacific, China also grew by accessing that one big great market of the United States of America. But we have seen some fundamental changes taking place at the turn of this century. And that is that whereas the global engines of economic growth and development had shifted to Asia, they were no longer limited only to East Asia. They were no longer limited to the People's Republic of China. Something fundamental was happening in the rest of Asia, as a result of which even countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, in Southeast Asia, and in South Asia, India, Bangladesh, and all the way up to Africa, the dynamic east coast of Africa, we were seeing a kind of renaissance, an economic growth that had not been witnessed before. And so this prosperity, growth, development, infrastructure, connectivity that was confined to one part, which occasioned this notion of the Asia-Pacific, had shifted in favor of a broader region that was straddled by two great oceans with an interconnecting space in between, that is the South China Sea. And everything that traversed through these waters, through these sea lines of communication, through the great trade and technology and terrorism connects between these, affected all of us. What happened in the AFPAC regions also affected the south of Thailand in terms of terrorism, or Indonesia for that matter, or for instance, the Philippines as well. And so in this broad interconnected space today, there is this notion of the Indo-Pacific. And this notion is far more democratic. It is far more inclusive. It is far more futuristic. It is far more accommodating of the aspirations of many more millions of people, and not just the limited numbers in East Asia. And so that is my pitch for the Indo-Pacific. We must also therefore keep in mind that we have today come to a stage where the world is being shocked at the very roots, shaken at the very roots by the war in Ukraine. It has not only upended European security paradigms, but it has also taken the oxygen out of certain other challenging issues like Afghanistan, once vivid on your television screens, not just not long ago, about a year or 12 or 14 months ago, we were looking at Afghanistan and the changes there. And in February of last year, the focus has shifted quite suddenly and entirely onto what is happening in Europe, as if Asia or its challenges do not really quite matter. That's the impression I get at times. We must also keep in mind, that we have seen how, the attention initially was also, thank you. No, that's all right. I'm fine. Thank you. I'll survive. The attention has also moved away from China, but not for long. And now we have seen how the United States of America, Japan, and others are taking a fresh look, the EU as well, and calling China a systemic rival. The United States has clearly identified China as a very major threat alongside Russia, but as a country that has the means and the vision to actually create a major disruption in the global order. So China by far is once again being regarded as the greater of the two challenges, though initially the impression was that the attention had shifted almost entirely onto Ukraine. But I do believe that the debilitating wars that the United States fights has weakened its ability militarily and economically speaking also. The United States has far too long looked at regions more through the security lens than through the economic lens, and which is one of the reasons why it actually fell behind in the Indo-Pacific space, in the Asia-Pacific space, because when it focused almost entirely on the global war on terror at the start of this century, it for a decade or more, a decade and a half, had taken its eyes off the ball, so to speak, left that space open for China, which always regarded that space much more through the economic lens than through the security lens. Today, the United States is shifting gear, and many other allies and other like-minded countries are also looking at this region through the economic lens. And so you have the whole idea of a Pacific step up by Australia, or for that matter, a partnership for the blue oceans, or something to that effect that the Americans have started, and the Indo-Pacific economic framework. This is really rather late in the day, but a welcome change in favor of an economic focus on the region. For that is the space which can be more fundamentally misused by the People's Republic. I want to also mention here that what is happening in Ukraine has also fed into the narratives in the Indo-Pacific in terms of military expenditures. As it is, Asia was home to some of the largest military expenditures in the world. As it is, Asia was a space where an economic architecture had been created over the years quite successfully in some parts of Asia. But this region had failed to put in place an overarching security structure that might be sustainable, one that might provide peace and security in the future. And to add to that problem now, we can see how events in Ukraine and China's continuing militarization and challenge posed to the region, including on Taiwan, is causing countries like Japan and Australia to sharply ramp up their defense budgets. So it's not just Germany that is increasing its defense budget. It is also Japan and Australia that is doing the same thing. And there are parallels that have been drawn between Ukraine and Taiwan as well. Taiwan is obviously apprehensive, notwithstanding the fact that it has a security treaty with the United States concluded way back in 1954. And so there is much speculation today, including in Japan, at the level of the Prime Minister. For instance, Prime Minister Kishida had said that Taiwan is also at risk. That what happened in Europe could as easily happen in Asia. And were that to happen, you can rest assured that Japan would quickly militarize even more, perhaps even go in for nuclear weapons. But the point here is that there are huge differences between Ukraine and Taiwan. For one, Ukraine did not have a major defense treaty with any power when the Russians mounted their so-called special military operation. On the other hand, Taiwan does have a treaty alliance partnership with the United States, on which President Biden has clarified that the US will stand by and protect Taiwan were it to be acted upon militarily by China. So I think in a way that changes and alters the position that the US had taken for all these years, one of strategic ambiguity. The United States has always said that it's in favor of a peaceful resolution. It is not against the unification of China. It has not challenged the notion of a one China, but it has always opposed any use of military power, and now quite explicitly so at the level of President Biden, and that changes things for Taiwan. Taiwan itself is no minnow. It is a major military power, and there is a body of water to be traversed before you can do anything in Taiwan. It's not just Taiwan that's ramping up its missile defense systems to be able to better protect itself across the Taiwan Strait, but the United States itself is changing tack and moving in for missile development, intermediate range, ballistic missiles. The intermediate range missiles, are no longer governed by any treaty. Just as the ABM treaty came to an end, the intermediate range missiles treaty also came to an end, and the Americans are taking a page out of the playbook of the Chinese by focusing back on missiles so that they're better able to guard their presence in the Indo-Pacific space, particularly in that theater, from Guam to Japan to South Korea to perhaps northern Australia as well. And so I have no doubt in my mind that were the mainland of Taiwan to be aggressed against, the United States will frontally enter the war without doubt, and that, to my mind at least, without doubt, Japan will also get embroiled in that war. For if Taiwan were to fall, Japan will find its main defense no longer available, will be extremely vulnerable. One of the reasons I must point out historically why in 1954, despite having a defense treaty, the Americans did not enter the fray during the first Taiwan Strait crisis, when the two offshore islands of Kinmen and Matsu were being bombed by artillery from the mainland. It's because the treaty did not cover those two islands, which are closest to China. The treaty did cover the Pescadores and the main island of Taiwan. It did not cover Tachan Islands, which is very close to the mainland, which had been taken already by the PLA, and Kinmen and Matsu that were bombed not only in 1954, but also once again in 57-58. But the mainland of Taiwan Island is a different matter altogether. Anyway, all this I have said basically to give you a broad overview of the international situation as it exists, the difficulties with bringing about change. But I must say a couple of words with your permission, if you don't mind, on the implications for India. All this great churn that is taking place, this great flux, this great uncertainty in a fractured world makes for very difficult choices for most countries around the world, and India is no exception. We have seen how India had to make certain choices with regard to Russia and the energy partnership in the midst of this unfolding saga in Ukraine. We have seen how, despite our very complex and difficult relations with the People's Republic of China, our trade has been growing. And yet we have taken the fundamental position that without there being peace and tranquility in our border areas, our relationship with China cannot be normalized. For very long, and particularly after Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988, and I was part of that visit as desk officer, I had sat in through the border talks in the 80s as well, the official rounds of talks. After 1988, the broad understanding was that we do have a boundary dispute, that this must be settled through peaceful negotiations, and that while we do so, we can continue to develop our relations across all other sectors and areas. And this is something that happened over the next 2 to 3 decades. But India did not benefit fully from that either, for there was continuing pressure on the boundary, attempts at incursions, etc. On the trade and economic side, there was a certain amount of gaming of the global trading system. And this was also evident in the manner in which India was not able to have a balanced trade with China. Its agricultural produce, like bitter gourd, for instance, its fruit like mangoes, its IT products and services, its pharmaceutical products always ran into a lot of roadblocks in China. And I was doing economic work 20 years ago in Shanghai, and I saw that again for myself. And so our point with China really remains that we do not discount the fact that we have a boundary dispute and that there are differences, but we cannot normalize bloodshed in our bilateral relations. We can normalize the existence of a bilateral dispute or a difference on the understanding that there will always be peace and that we will try to address it through peaceful dialogue. But if it is a suggestion that there should be, there can be bloodshed, then I'm afraid we have a fundamental position that rejects that. We today are the G20 president, at least for the next 9 months. This is a great opportunity for India to give fresh impetus to the objective of reforming multilateral institutions that are unrepresentative as well as ineffective. And you might well ask the question that just a while ago I said that it's very difficult to change the global order and that this happens only if there's a catastrophe or a cataclysmic event or war. And so how then do you think you're going to change this? Now, I do believe that we cannot change it overnight. I do believe that there is no need to challenge the existing global order. We must neither seek to challenge the existing global order nor seek to replace it overnight with anything else. But we must continue to convince our interlocutors from this very important seat of responsibility as a G20 president that is to say the global order, the United Nations, the Security Council are in dire need of reforms and that these reforms must come about. We must also use the G20 presidency to work with the existing global system. We must use this opportunity to also make the broad point that the G20, which is quite representative with 19 countries and the EU, offers an area of refuge, solace, a platform, a pull-aside, wayside point on a highway that is gridlocked. There is a great traffic jam, but if you pull aside, you can step out of your vehicle, stretch your legs, have a conversation, have a coffee, and also perhaps go in for low-hanging fruit, which we've lost the ability to deliver on the international stage. And this gives the great powers, the major powers that are at loggerheads, a chance to step aside and deliver on small things in the context of the G20 that might pave the way for a greater mutual understanding and a cooperative structure in the future. And so I think it's vital that we do this in a carefully crafted manner. And therefore, one of the most important things is to go by the motto of the G20, which is one earth, one family, one future, or Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We carry the whole world with us. And so as we speak of the the Global South, and representing the Global South, and being the voice for them, we must not ignore some of the interests of the West as well. For if we do that, we'll do it at our peril. The G20 can also as easily descend into a platform where positions are gridlocked. And I think India's diplomacy today, led by the Prime Minister himself, with very active and able players that we have on the global stage, we should be in a position to carve out a new vision and framework for the rest of the world. We should be able to deliver on vision, on the vision of the Prime Minister, for instance, on lifestyle for environment as well, where we want to work to create a planet full of pro-planet people, PPP, for instance, where the individual is made responsible for his actions, to go in for what you call a moderation in consumption, to go in for a circular economy, to go in for reusing, repairing and recycling, and not to stress this one and only planet that we have before us. And likewise, we can do a lot with regard to macroeconomic development, kickstarting economic recovery in debt-distressed economies around the world. There are more than 75. We should be looking at equal access to the digital economy. We should be looking at climate change, healthcare. And in all this, we have, as you know, the Think 20, which both I and Professor Harsh Pant represent here today. We will do our best. We want to take each one of you with us. We value your views. We have created a special innovative ideas Dropbox in our secretariat, where you can visit the T20 website and contribute with your own ideas in about 300 words. And we intend to do many more of these events with the youth of India, what you might call town hall events such as this one. And so with these words, let me thank you once again for having heard me with great patience. I have exceeded my time, but then you asked for it. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Chinoy sir. This question is for you actually. Thank you so much. It is nice to hear to you today, first of all. Sir, you explained to us the geopolitics which is happening earlier in your speech. But it is a challenge for India today, especially when China is troubling us in one hand and terrorism on the other hand. But how would you look at the USA, which has sometimes has double standards? It explains to us, it sometimes talks about stopping terrorism on one hand, but on the other hand, it does nothing, but just speaks and talks. So how is India looking forward to it, and how India is trying to deal with it, the same matter?
So our relationship with the United States, as you know, has often been described as one of estranged democracies that have finally found one another. And I think this has happened in a specific context because for the first time in 77 years, the US has felt truly challenged. And it has also woken up to the fact that it has actually helped create a very big and systemic rival in the People's Republic of China. So I think the United States, has been wavering in terms of its outlook on China for a very long time. And this precedes, in fact, the Second World War. Even at the time of Woodrow Wilson, and Professor Pant would know this better, there was a great deal of sympathy for what was happening in China. Then the US has always been taken up with a certain sense of romanticism when it has looked at China. Through the writings of people like Pearl Buck and later, Edgar Snow, who kind of made a Robin Hood out of Mao Zedong. And that kind of image of China as a large agrarian country with a civilization going back 5,000 years has always caught the fancy of a large number of Americans. And I think this wavering policy on China is to be seen particularly in stark terms in the reset button that they pressed in 1971. And I think the image that they had then was that if the People's Republic of China, the millions of people there, were to drink a can of Coke a day and visit McDonald's once a week and wear jeans, blue jeans, they are likely to behave like us, think like us, and follow a social and political system that is open and democratic. And that notion has been completely disabused today. In 2007, there was a book written by James Mann, if I'm not mistaken, titled The China Fantasy. It's a readable book because here's one American himself pointing out the fanciful thinking that has guided US's China policy. Now, towards India, as you know, we've also gone through a roller coaster with the United States of America. Frankly, we have a great deal more in common with the US and they with us than we with other powers as the world's largest and the world's oldest and the world's most populous democracies come together. We ought to have been working close together in the past, but the Cold War, discourse divided us. We were seen as a spoil sport of sorts in terms of the discourse in the 1950s, where India stood on the side of the non-aligned and called for an end to nuclear weapons, and we were one of the sharpest critics of nuclear weapons through the 50s and 60s. We were one of the strongest advocates of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty until the shutters went down quite suddenly with the announcement that only those who have tested and acquired nuclear weapons before, I think it was 1st January 1967, will be, deemed to be nuclear weapon states. And a disillusioned India then obviously rejected the NPT. So the Americans have also seen, South Asia through the lens of India and Pakistan, and hyphenated at that. And Pakistan has always had a certain advantage in terms of a military regime being able to cooperate with the American state and deep state without being accountable to its people. It being seen as a frontline, sort of interlocutor for the, West Asian theater with regard to the Islamic world as well. And so for all those and many other fanciful notions, Pakistan also was a great factor in our not coming close to the United States. But I think the penny has fallen now in a more conclusive manner. And the United States recognizes, and I think we have been described variously as the linchpin in the Indo-Pacific, etc. I think the United States has finally realized that it cannot tackle, the unbridled growth of China, the unbridled expression of its military power on its own, especially in the theater closest to China. As we look at the rest of the world, I think Chinese power, military power also shows a great deal of fade out. Its economic power is intact, its BRI power is intact, but not so its military power. The United States still is the world's most dominant economy and the world's most dominant military power, not to be underestimated. But for it to tackle China in this theater by itself is also, to the United States, increasingly a chimera. And India is seen increasingly as a like-minded partner that can work together. One point I do want to mention here, that while we are extremely close to the United States now, it's one of our closest strategic partners, most valued at that. And I think a relationship of benevolence between the two can be a game changer for India, just as it was a great game changer for the People's Republic of China. So I see no reason why such a relationship, one of mutual benevolence and friendship and cooperation, should not turn the page of history for us as well, in as conclusive a manner that it did for the People's Republic of China. But do not expect the United States to come and pick your chestnuts out of the fire in Ladakh, so to speak. Because I must point out here, as a scholar of China and this relationship, that the United States shows J&K to be disputed territory and Aksai Chin to be disputed. But furthermore, in the Quad, Japan and Australia show Aksai Chin to be a part of China. And so much for the wild notion that, this Quad business will get everybody together, standing shoulder to shoulder against the Chinese in Ladakh. There, mind you, we are on our own. As far as the maritime theater is concerned, which is where the three other maritime powers in the Quad want us to do more, we have to pick and choose depending on our capacities. But this relationship is fundamental, in my view, to India's rise as an economy in the 21st century, more particularly with regard to technology. Even today, access to that one big, great economy, access to its technology, access to its defense technology can change fortunes for us. Thank you.
Yes, so we have a few questions at the back. Yes, sir.
My name is Tony and I'm from Kenya. Yes. Your Excellency Ambassador, mine is just seeking your comment on something. How relevant is Dag Hammarskjöld's United Nations in today's scenario, particularly in transforming global institutions?
I thought I took about 45 minutes to say that. But I don't mind, maybe you came in a little late, but yeah, so you missed 45 minutes of that. But I do think that this is a different world. And as our own young colleagues have also pointed out in their very, very nice and perceptive presentations. And let me compliment you for your understanding of this issue, that it's a different world. And today's world really cannot work on the basis of an outdated, archaic framework that was established way back in 1945, and also grounded on the principle of embedded inequality right from the word go. Right from the word go, there are categories there, there is exceptionalism there, there are powers that have been brought in, some say to add a little color to what was otherwise an entirely European looking permanent council, permanent membership of the Council of four, the fifth one comes in from Asia. No real yardstick on the basis of which you can select, except that they were victors in that great war, and to the victors go all the spoils, so to speak. Was that the basis? If it was the basis, it was an extremely inegalitarian basis, one in which exceptionalism became a principle right from the day go. Now it did work, in my view. This is not to castigate the United Nations or to undermine its continued relevance. It did the job for a while. There was hope and expectation, and one might even say that the exercise of veto power also stabilized to a certain extent, the great power contestation during the Cold War. It prevented one bloc from doing anything quite very extreme, because the other bloc was able to either step in through proxy wars to neutralize the other's great power projection, as we have seen, as I said, variously in from Korea to Vietnam to Angola to Afghanistan. We have seen that proxy neutralization of the other's great power projection was possible during the Cold War. But the UN, I think, began to become a fig leaf of sorts, beginning with primarily the first Gulf War. If you go back to UN Security Council resolution, was it 678, which first authorized like-minded countries to come together. The one on which China was expected to oppose, but it abstained quite cleverly to allow the West to do what it wanted to. So beginning at that point of time, the UN has often been a fig leaf. But one might even argue that wasn't the UN a fig leaf even in the Korean War? And I'd say yes, there is a point there, because the US entered the war first, with MacArthur leading the charge of the Light Brigade there. And it is the UN that gave sanction a little later to what became a UN-sanctioned, US-led, multilateral UN force there in Korea, lasting all of 3 years until 1953. So the UN has always had this dichotomous situation of being relevant and then sometimes not being quite so relevant. And this has a lot to do with great power exceptionalism. In a unipolar world, this is much more likely to happen. In a multipolar world, this is a lot less likely to happen. So what we should be doing as India is to lead the world, even with the existing structures of the UN, and surely none of us want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there is a structure in place. What really can be done is to make it more multipolar. But multipolar not just from the outside, multipolar also from within. And for me, multipolarity also means that the UN Security Council must give up its exceptionalism. And I'm someone who firmly believes that there are spent powers there. And there are rising and potent powers, emerging powers that are not represented. Now, isn't it inconceivable that a country like India, with 1.4 billion people, and it's been in the news that we have overtaken China by some count already, that a country that is fair or foul, abreast of whatever is happening in the world today, has one of the world's largest economies, has the world's fastest growing economy, has an economy that's been certified even by, Goldman Sachs way back 20 years ago as the only one that's likely to be able to keep up a growth rate of 5.5% or more till the middle of this century, that this great country with nuclear weapons as well, not that we want to, flaunt that, but the point is that on every conceivable yardstick, our contribution to peacekeeping operations, our contribution to healthcare, not just through vaccine Maitri, but now vaccine Arogya that we are looking at on a more permanent, sustained basis in the maritime domain. We have been out there, despite our challenge of growth in a finite, in a progressive manner. We have signed on to a target early on of Panchamrit in regard to greening of our economy and reaching net zero by 2070. We should be there. So you as youth, I think, should be working for this notion of multipolarity. But a multipolar world in which we don't want to simply, like Animal Farm, create again a new body of bullies. We want it to be a fair and equitable world in which we can actually share our great values with the rest, to reform them through the power of conviction also. While I said change will not come as a result of simply change of heart, that's the realist view that I have. But there is also the hope and expectation that at the end of the day, if we can convince human beings at the individual level, even in the West, there are fair and well-meaning people everywhere, that we might be able to steer this great ship of international relations, multilateral system. Even if it's broke a bit, we can fix it by moving to multipolarity, in which India will be one of the poles, understandably, unarguably.
And I think part of this conversation with youth is also to develop a better understanding of multilateralism. And there is a certain despondency that surrounds multilateralism these days. Every single presentation that we had, I think I and Ambassador Chinoy, all of us talked about the almost demise of multilateralism. And I think that the challenge is, what do you do with the ruins that are there? In fact, can we conceive of a new architecture? And that's why I think these kind of conversations are so important, because we don't want to go down a path where we are all very despondent about the world order and multilateralism and therefore give up our hands in despair. But I think we are running out of time. So I think let's take 3 questions together as a group.
I should try to be brief.
So I'll take one from here and one from the back. Yes, sir.
Hello, sir. I am Abhishek Vagdare. How India can deal with betterly deal with Russia regarding Russian oil, if while the European countries and Westerns are making some pressure on India regarding that?
There was a lady at the back. Yes, yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Hello. Good afternoon, sirs. My name is Vaijayanti, and I just wanted to pick your brain a bit about multilateralism vis-a-vis like domestic politics. This is specifically in context to the Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan topic that you brought up, where we're seeing sort of increasing military posturizing by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. So I wanted to know, how much of it do you think is informed by like domestic political leanings given the LDP in Japan and PPP in South Korea, and how much of it is that there is a credible threat of a knock-on effect of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and then China invading Taiwan?
And one from here. I think there was some, yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Sanket Shirsat. I'm from Kohinoor Management School. My question is to Chinoy sir. The question is, there was a news which I read in the newspaper that Israel is going to attack Iran very soon. So what India should take the stand by in this situation, because for India, both are close friends.
So, sir, you have a range of topics: Russia, Ukraine, domestic politics in Indo-Pacific, and in Middle East.
So as far as oil is concerned from Russia, let me put it this way, that oil is a fungible product. And it is something that is available around the world in the global oil market. There are oil swaps also in the international market. So India, obviously, in my view, faced a choice there of at a time when oil prices were showing signs of going upwards in terms of availability as well, shortages as a result of the war in Ukraine, that Russian oil, which India did buy, but in very small quantities earlier, India has signed on to new agreements to buy more of that oil. So oil, in short, is a fungible product. The West has been buying Russia's energy resources for very long. As you know, it's an energy-driven market. The Russian economy is based on commodities like Brazil's in the BRICS. So there's nothing extraordinary about the fact that India is continuing to buy Russian oil, and because of its availability at a certain price, doing the best it can by its own economy. I mean, the primary purpose here is to provide adequate energy for our own economic growth and development. And like I think our foreign ministers also said it, on a number of occasions, we owe it to our own people to provide them energy at the lowest possible cost, and at a time when the rest of the world continues to buy Russian oil or Russian molecules, the natural gas, whether through this pipeline or that pipeline, or whether in a pure form or a mixed form, they get around to the same economies. So much for that. As far as whether it's the domestic discourse that drives the narrative in our part of the world, or whether it is the external dynamics, I personally feel it's the external dynamics. I mean, you mentioned Japan, a country to which I have served as ambassador. And so we look at Japan as a monolithic country, not just in terms of its ethnic profile, but we believe that there is this one great big party there called the LDP. But you must know that the LDP is an amalgam of a very large number of parties and political viewpoints. And so within the LDP also, for instance, when I was there, someone like, at that time, the Secretary General, the redoubtable Mr. Toshihiro Nikai, was himself a great votary for very close ties with the People's Republic of China. He's the one who would always lead the large delegations from Japan to China, 2,000, 3,000 people. And there were equally voices within the LDP, including late Prime Minister Abe and people who supported him, who spoke for a more robust posture vis-a-vis an obvious military threat, one where Japan's options were constrained because of this overwhelming economic reliance on China, because all of Japan's supply chains flowed out of China, radiated out of there. So I think the domestic discourse is less important than the external one. I found that in Korea as well. Under the new government in Korea, Korea has taken a leap of faith, if I could put it that way, into this whole idea of the Indo-Pacific. No longer is it looking at appeasement of its northern neighbor and therefore indirect appeasement of the People's Republic of China. It's quite open to working with the rest. And it's also, I think, demonstrated its newfound abilities as a great defense manufacturer. Not just that it sold us the K9 Vajra howitzer, but look at the number of weapons that the Europeans are buying today, sourcing from Korea, as they reach yet again one of those points in history where they're running out of ammunition, there's not enough guns, not enough tanks. And the Second World War saw a lot of that happening both in the UK and France, which is why these two great countries, while fighting their adversaries, had to turn to the US. Today in Asia, the Europeans are turning to, guess who? Republic of Korea for weapons. So I think it's the external discourse. The fact that there is a live threat. For the Europeans, it's Russia. For many of us in Asia, it's been a long-standing threat perception that unregulated, unbridled growth of China, not in a fair manner, but through gaming the system, has actually worked to the disadvantage of a lot of others. But that's behind us now. As far as Israel and Iran are concerned, that was the third question. I mean, frankly, you read it in the papers, and I don't want to second guess what the Israelis would do or the Iranians would do. But at the end of the day, we are aware of the fact that there are fundamentally irreconcilable viewpoints in these two countries about the other. Iran has never reconciled itself, at least post the revolution, to the existence of Israel. And Israel likewise views Iran as a fundamental source of, it's an existential threat also for Israel. So what the two might do to each other or to the rest of the region is left to speculation. From India's point of view, we, yes, do have good relations with the both of them, and we should be urging them as our close partners to work together for peace. And that's in the interest of the entire region.
I'm told that we have run out of time, so I think if yes, so I can see one hand up. Okay, so let's give him a chance.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Karan Longotia from Kohinoor Management School. I just want to ask about SARC nation, where SARC established, when the SARC established to coordinate with the countries and bilateral trade. So for last so many years, where the SARC did not get trade or they have a meeting with each others. So how it will impact the South Asia? Because what we see that China is being Nepal, they're controlling the Communist Party. They are just putting their money in the Maldives. They are controlling the Maldives for so many years. And India is putting their own money to means come up with what the Maldives has faced the economic crisis, and India puts money. So why we didn't catch these things to before China has means जो इकोनॉमिक क्राइसिस हो रहा है तो उसके पहले इंडिया कुछ करे ताकि ये क्राइसिस ना आए और सार्क को वो कैसे लीड करे.
So I think the first reason is that it is now that India has the extra resources to be able to do something more fundamental for the region, much more than in the past. And China had obviously a head start in that regard because its economy has been growing at runaway rates of growth for decades, as you know. So we are now kind of stepping up to the plate with our own neighborhood first policy, which is quite successful. And things are not quite so as bad as you are making them out to be in the Maldives and some of these friendly nations. The Maldives is in fact a very close and friendly maritime neighbor. But the fact of the matter is still the nub of the problem which you referred to, whether or not SARC has delivered in a broader context of what you call regional integration or regional economic cooperation or regional delivery on sort of developmental issues which matter a great deal to all of us and which also straddle and transcend boundaries like water security, food security, forced migrations. Aren't we seeing some of that when the Kuki, Chin, etc. step in or the Rohingyas step in? There's no escaping from the fact that we are a region, conjoined at the hips and we will have to take into account some of these issues. But South Asia has generally underperformed with regard to integration, and on the economic front, no more than 5% of its trade is intra-regional trade. This is abysmally poor compared to other parts of the world. Those that have actually seen faster progress have been premised on regional integration and regional cooperation, not just Europe. Take Southeast Asia or take East Asia. So I think it is in India's interest to have this Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas neighborhood first policy, because if we alone were to progress and there is scant regional integration, it's going to come back to bite us at the end of the day. And therefore, I think we are doing much more on that front. Now, if there are laggards in this, if there are holdouts, if there are, members or a member particularly in SARC that holds up and holds to hostage the progress of the rest of us, then we will obviously look to reshaping what we define as regional cooperation. We're going to be looking at, BIMSTEC or the BBIN. We're going to be looking at our Act East policy at Southeast Asia. We're going to be looking at the broader extended neighborhood, the maritime theater, to redefine what we might call our region and extended region. In that, rest assured, India is front and center and well regarded as a net provider. I don't want to use net security provider, for that word, has several meanings, but a net provider when it comes to, food security. Even for Egypt, we are providing grain, for instance, aren't we? We are providing water to the Maldives when they have problems and shortages through Operation Neer, for instance. Post tsunami, we have been providing other assistance to several countries, to Nepal after the earthquake. So to Sri Lanka more recently with regard to bilateral assistance to the tune of roughly $3.9 billion or so, and also helping them get a good deal out of the IMF. So as young scholars, I would say focus on new ideas for how we might get regional integration, regional economic cooperation going. At the end of the day, a rising power like India will require a certain amount of regional consensus also. For no great powers have ultimately emerged or sustained themselves without a regional consensus on their rise. So all that drags us back in our region, countries, vested interests, terrorism, etc. We've got to put it behind us. And I think one of the answers would be wider economic development. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think that's a very good note to end, because ultimately it is also about new ideas. And so we welcome new ideas from you all. As Ambassador mentioned, there is on the website, you can also put in your ideas directly. It will go into the policy making of G20's agenda. But I think it's a very, I think the question was, the last question touches very directly to the question to the issue that we are discussing today about multilateralism, because all the issues that are that we were talking about as part of global multilateralism are part of, in some ways, of regional multilateralism. And I think all of those issues were touched upon today. So thank you so much, and let me hand it back to you now.
And thank you.
May I please invite Professor B.V. Bhosle, Charge Director, School of International Relations and Strategic Studies, University of Mumbai, to deliver the closing remarks and vote of thanks.
Namaskar to everyone. So I'm in front of you to propose a formal vote of thanks to our dignitaries, especially Ambassador Sujan Chinay. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I would also like to thank Professor Harsh Pant for making his introductory remarks. Ambassador, sir, I was listening to you very carefully.
I hope I get pass marks.
I will decide. You took us through different events in history, and also your concerns, how India should be playing its role in G20. I have some, not questions, but how India could be playing its role in the present world order. I equally see the role of the multilateral organizations, very important. But somewhere I feel that, as the title is, towards reformed multilateralism becomes extremely important, and here where I think every one of us will have to do its bit. I must assure the House, on behalf of School of International Relations, on Department of Civics and Political Science, so we are prepared to take this challenge of G20 and the agenda of it. There are n number of issues, different organizations with overlapping agendas, which was being pointed out by Rishi Chaudhary. And even I find it quite confusing. And the hype of G20 now. We had ASEAN, we had SAARC, we had some other platforms. How effective G20 is going to be in sorting out these different kinds of crises, whether it is in the field of agriculture, whether in the field of health, medicine. But these two events, I think, has completely changed the destiny of the world, which I feel one is the pandemic, and second one is the Russian-Ukraine war, which has been impacted different economies of the world. It's a high time that multilateral organizations play their role, whether it is WTO, whether it is World Health Organization, whether it is International Labour Organization, and more important, United Nations Security Council. Sometimes I wonder where are these when the Russian-Ukraine war is happening, and why the war is not coming to an end. Has the multilateral treaties completely become defunct? Is it not the crisis of the international law? So these are some of the questions, sir, which is coming to my mind. You've been in the field for a very long time. You have the actual data on it. But we people sitting at the universities, please tell us what we should be doing, because we have not seen that kind of different realities. I think Observer Research Foundation has given us this opportunity to come together as a result of the G20 meeting. And I'm sure there will be many such gatherings to take this agenda of G20, T20 ahead. On behalf of University of Mumbai, School of International Relations and Strategic Studies, with the permission of Professor Deepak Pawarji, on behalf of the Department of Civics and Politics, I thank not one star but 2 stars, Ambassador Sujan Chinoy and Professor Harsh Pant, for giving the opportunity to University of Mumbai to set this agenda. And definitely, we will perform our role in the days to come. Anything to be done from our side, please tell us, and we will be there. With these words, I would like to thank both the dignitaries, Professor Chinoy and Professor Harsh Pant. I like to thank even the Department of Civics and Politics, the head of the department, Professor Deepak Pawarji, our other faculty member, Dr. Joshi, distinguished faculty, and of course, my dear students, how can I miss you? It is because of you this event is possible. And we will bother you in the days to come. Thank you. Thank you very much.